Thank you very much. That worked first time. Awesome. So thanks for coming. We're going to talk a little bit about debugging. So this is debugging elephants. Everybody knows what an elephant is, right? Yep. We are elephants. We're elephants. We're PHP developers. So the little stuffed animals, that's us in stuffed form. But anyway, so I talk about debugging elephants. I'm not going to talk about how to set up a debugger, because that's pretty relative. It's pretty easy to do. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about actually debugging, which is something that I find as a consultant I often get questions about. So again, my name's Adam Culp. You can find me on Adam Culp on Twitter. If you have any questions or any comments, please share them with me. I appreciate that. Now, for those of you who have already seen one of my talks, ignore the next few minutes, because I'm going to talk a little bit about me. I'm an open source contributor. I'm also on the Zen Certification Advisory Board. I helped create the PHP certification exam and the Zen Framework certification exam. I encourage all developers to get certified if you're not. Not so much to say you know it all, because generally you don't if you're certified, but certification allows you to tell an employer, I know enough to help you. That's what a certification is for. It's not to know the most. It's not to prove you know the most, although it does make you feel good when you have a certification. It is just to be able to go to an employer and say, hey, I know enough that I can help you with your project, whether it's PHP, Zen Framework, what have you. I'm also a consultant at Zen. Actually, it's RogueWave. Zen is now a product line of RogueWave. And I do consulting. I go out to companies and I help them debug. I help them create clean architecture for their code. I help them fix problems. Sometimes I do audits. Companies don't know exactly what they have in an application, so they ask me to go out and do a nice audit so they understand what they have, what they might need to do to improve their applications. I'm also the organizer of the South Florida PHP user group in South Florida and the organizer of Sunshine PHP, which happens every February in Miami. If you're not doing anything in February, come down and see us in Miami. There are worse places you can be in February than Miami. So come down and see us. It's usually pretty nice there. I'm also a long-distance ultra runner, photography enthusiast, and a black belt in judo. So, you know, when you're talking to the recruiters and you see the ads for a PHP Ninja, that's me. So I help build the web. I help people build the web. I consult and I help people do better. And this talk is about part of that. It's about debugging. Now, all of us, throughout all of our history, because PHP makes it easy for us to debug in a manual way, most of us start out doing that. We start out with things like echo and print R, var dumps, and then we do die statements so it doesn't continue going. We might do a console log if we're doing JavaScript, things like that. There's also toolbars out there that enable us to debug a little bit better. Zen has one called Z-Ray that's part of Zen Server that allows you to debug. The Zen Framework has one built by the community for Zen Framework. Symphony has theirs. I don't know if Laravel has one or not, but most of the, there's a lot of toolbars out there to help us debug and help us do better in our applications, or we're doing it manually. Now, this talk is not about doing it manually, because we don't want to end up with things like this in our code, right? How many people have done this? Yep, you've done echo 1, echo 2, echo 3, because you want to see how far it gets in your code, right? So we do it this way, and we've all done it, and we all continue to do it occasionally. What I'm talking about, though, is automating this process. Using automation to go through and do step debugging using an IDE or something like that, a little bit more optimal, because then we don't have to add in these echo statements. We don't have to add things into our code. Instead, we kick off the step debugger from a browser to our IDE, and then we follow it a line at a time, or we add breakpoints to stop it at certain areas so we can see what the values of the variables and the values of the objects are in real time. And that's what we do. So with the step debugging, it makes it really nice. And it's more automated, so we're not doing it in a standard way. Now, kind of in line with that, we can add breakpoints into our code. And it looks something like this in an IDE. Now, again, I'm not covering any specific IDE because, we know PHP Storm, Zen Studio, Eclipse, there's many IDEs out there. Instead, I'm talking about this more in a generic form. They all do debugging pretty similar. It's all pretty much the same thing. And I'm not going to talk about Xdebug versus Zen Debugger or anything like that because they do pretty much the same thing. So instead, we're just going to focus on how it works and how we use it. In this case, we're looking at some code. Now, in the gutter, which is the far side way over here, you can add red dots, and those are breakpoints, and that tells the debugger, it tells the browser or the IDE to stop at that point. And then you can go to the next one and to the next one, as the case may be. And that's pretty much how breakpoints work in the IDE. We're going to show you a little bit more of those in practical use in just a bit. But anyway, just know that you can set points in your code and say, okay, stop there, right? Now, you can set the debugger so that it stops at the first line of code, and then you start debugging from there a line at a time if you need to do that. But generally speaking, it's much easier, more optimal to say, I want to stop in these points. So you click over in the left-hand gutter in your IDE and activate the red dot, so that way it stops there. Now, after you do that, you're going to want to turn on the listener. Now, whether it's Storm or Zen Studio, whatever the case might be, you turn on a listener, and that listener is listening locally, generally, for remote, where you want to do this from a server, and you can do it from a server. You don't have to do it locally. You can activate from the server and tell it, where your IDE is and how to communicate and everything else. But in this example, I'm doing it mostly local. All I have to do is click listen, and then I can pull it up in the IDE, and it just works, generally. In most IDEs, when you do it the first time, you turn on the listener, and then you fire up the browser, and you say, debug this page, or debug next page, whatever the case might be. It's then going to tell the IDE, hey, there's a debug session, you're listening, I want you to debug this. And then the IDE generally opens up some sort of window and says, do you want to allow it? And you say yes, and it creates a server for you in your configuration. It's very easy these days to get this done. Where it's not easy to get them configured is if it's a remote server, or if you have to go through a firewall, and then you have to activate some sort of tunneling, something like that. It can be very difficult to set up some configurations. But once you get it set up, it's pretty much just a done deal. So with the listener, generally you're activating some sort of icon over here. And it's like in PHP Storm, it's like a telephone receiver, the old style telephone receivers, and you click it and it turns green, right? The listening turns green. And then you know that it's listening. It's listening. It's waiting for the browser to send it a signal. So then you hit the URL in your browser, and the browser communicates back to the IDE and says, okay, start the debug session. Now, generally there's going to be some sort of panel that opens up for debugging, or in Zen Studio or Eclipse-based IDEs, it might open up a whole perspective that is geared toward debugging with your different panels optimized for debugging your code. I'm not going to go too much into detail of those, but some of the things I do want to talk about is how we go about the debugging. There are a few things that generally you're going to want to do. First, let me ask, how many people do step debugging already? Excellent. That is awesome. How many of you do it every single time? Okay, good. Good. There's some of you. Now, that being said, I realize that most people don't do it every single time. I try to do it every single time, but it's so easy to do a print R or a var dump or something like that. It's addictive, right? It's easy. Just let me do this real quick. But then, of course, you have to make sure you remove it, because the last thing you want is an echo or a print R in production. So that's another reason why I try not to do it, because my memory is very terrible, and I always forget to remove it. And then it ends up in production, and that's not a good thing. I get my hand slapped for that. But so step debugging. So we have three things that I'm going to cover a little bit, and that is we have step over, we have step into. Now there's usually a force step into as well. And then we have step out. So those are the three things that generally you use most of the time when you're doing step debugging. And we're going to talk a little bit about these. So I realize that the bottom is probably a little bit dark. That's not too important, because I'm going to actually be doing an example of this, and I'll use the lighter theme on PHP Storm so you can see it a lot better. But first there's step over. So step over basically says, and if you're able to see it over here, there is actually a command where we're calling a function. We're calling a method get attribute, right? So if I was to do step over, instead of executing and following that method, instead of going into get attribute next, step over would say ignore that and go to the next thing. Don't go into that. Don't dig into it. Don't go down that rabbit hole. Go to the next thing. And that's what step over does. Step over allows us to skip something. Now, alternatively, you could use step into. Now, step into says go down that rabbit hole, follow that function and go all the way through it. I need to see something there, right? And that's what step into does. It follows whatever the execution is and goes into it. Now, let's say, for instance, you do follow something and you go down the rabbit hole of it and you get deep into it and you're like, okay, I already found what I wanted. I don't need to keep going, right? I don't want to keep going. I want to go back now to where it went into that function. So that's where step out comes in. And step out says, I don't want to go any farther. Go back to where we started. So go back to where the get attribute function was called and start back there. And that's basically what it does. So it allows us to kind of escape out of where we were. Maybe we dug into it and we saw the value of a variable that was actually what we needed, or maybe we saw where a value was being set somewhere. We no longer need to do that, right? We no longer need to continue the execution, so we can stop it. And that's how that works. So those are the base functions that you're going to use most of the time as you're debugging. So with that, I want to go ahead and I have a sample application here that I created. Now, this is a Zend expressive application, but it doesn't matter what it is. It could be anything, right? It could be Zend Framework, could be Laravel, could have been anything. But I made it a Zend expressive app because I wanted to play with Zend expressive one afternoon, so I made a Zend expressive app. So what this app does, I called it Mindful or Mindful, however you want to call it. It's kind of a fun thing. It's basically a place where PHP developers can go and they can set a geography, which is where they of course live. They could assign themselves a habitat like an office or a park or a coffee shop, something like that. They can choose a herd, like are you in the Laravel herd, or are you in the Zend Framework herd, are you in the Symfony herd, right? Maybe WordPress, maybe Drupal, something like that. And then we can, of course, choose migrations, which are the conferences. We migrate to conferences. So, again, it was just kind of a fun app that I thought I'd put together. So in this app, or any app for that matter, maybe there's something that we want to debug. Maybe there's something that we want to check. I want to see how some variables are being set. I want to see how the IDs are being used through it. Now, this is a very simple app. It's not extreme. It's not a big enterprise level app. It's just a simple CRUD app that does just this. Because it's ultimately we just want a place where developers can put their memories, because elephants should never forget. So we have to put our memories in here so we don't forget. Now, by that same token, I also have PHP Storm open here. And I got the project open, and you can see I got a couple breakpoints set here. Those are the red dots. It's kind of hard to see the red on the screen, but I've got some breakpoints set in there. And this is the debug panel along the bottom. So what I'm going to do is, let's say we want to debug something. So I'm going to go back to the app. Well, first, as I said earlier, I have to turn on the listener. Now, up in the top right, it's probably hard to see, because it's hard for me to see. This is the listener. So if I click that, now it's listening. It turned green up there. So now I know that the debugger is listening. In this case, I'm actually using Xdebug under the hood. Xdebug, I had to set in the IP address. So as long as the local network here didn't assign me a new IP address, I should be able to, it should be working. Otherwise, I have to edit my Xdebug INI. So back here now, if I were to click something like migrations, I want to go into migrations, so I click it, you'll notice that it doesn't actually go to the page. That's because it's in debug mode, right? So it's listening. It knows the browser is debugging. So if I go back to the back to the IDE, we can see it is in fact debugging. I can kind of tell that because there's a green arrow over here down in the bottom left that's saying it's running. There's also a red square where I could stop it if I wanted to. And I can see that there's a line highlighted, so that's the line in the code. I have PHP Storm set at the moment to stop at the first line of code that's executed. So doing this, I could use the arrows down here in the bottom. Now the first arrow here is step over. The next one is step into. There's a fourth step into, and then there's step out, if I wanted to get out of what I'm doing, right? So that's basically the base functions of it. So now if I click, in this case, I want to click step over. And as I click a step over, it doesn't go into any of those functions or anything there. It goes to the next thing, click step over again. It's going to load the Composer Auto Loader. Now, if I click step into, it's going to go into the Composer Auto Loader and go through the lines there as they may be executed. I'm going to skip past that, go down, and we're doing a call user func. In this case, an anonymous function where we're loading, Zend Expressive and getting it up and running. So that way we have our configurations and everything. Now, I do have some breakpoints set in here. So if I step over again, step over will say don't go into any of those functions. However, if you have a breakpoint, it stops it anyway, right? It stops where I wanted it to stop. And that's basically right here. We're calling it a Flash Messenger. In this case, I'm using Slim Flash Messenger, and as one of the middlewares for Zend Expressive, I decided to use that as the Flash messaging. And here it's actually calling it from getAttribute because it's being added into the container, and then I'm calling it from there through the request. Now, right now, there's no value set in here. I want to actually get rid of a panel. There we go. Now the code's a little bit bigger. You'll notice up here, while I'm in debug mode, you'll notice some extra data out on the right. You notice that? That's not PHP code. That's PHP Storm putting the value there. So I can see it, and it's grayed out so that way it's not intrusive, but at the same time I can see what the value of that variable is, or further down I can see the value of things being set. In this case, I'm going to be working with an object, so if I click next, right, I'm not going to go into it at the moment. I'm going to skip over it and go to the next breakpoint, and when I do that, you'll notice now, out to the right, I've now got values there for that object, right? So now I can see all those right there on my screen. Now if I mouse over this, I can actually see the value of it by mousing over it. That's how debugging works. You can see it that way. Now down here in the bottom panel, the debugger panel, I can dig in even further there as well. So say I wanted to go in and see some of the values of the delegates and the queues. Maybe I want to go into Flash and see the values that are set there. Right now, nothing's actually set there, but I can see the objects there. Right? If there were values in it, I could freely pull those. I can also dig into the request and see what kind of attributes are there as far as CSRF and Flash and things like that. I can debug these in real time because now they're represented there. This page is still executing in the browser. And our response has not been sent, so the browser is still sitting there waiting. So I can see all this. Now if I click next here, right, I want to go past that and go to the next item. You'll notice that now Get Messages now has items out here to the right because the messages, of course, are being hopefully pulled from Flash Messenger if there are any. In this case, there aren't any, so they're not there. And then it's going to the next one, which is I'm trying to use Doctrine Deball because I use that in this as well, this project. And I'm doing a fetch all, very sloppy MySQL being put in there. But anyways, just an example. So now if I were to dig into this, though, let's say I wanted to go into the next step. Let's say I wanted to step into instead of step over, because I've been doing a lot of stepping over. If I want to step into, and I do that, now it goes into the execute query, right? It's going into the fetch all, and I'm going to dig into it. If I keep stepping into, then I'm going to go into where it's building the query and everything, and it's going in a step at a time, so I can see what's happening. How many times have you tried debugging code and you end up in an interface? So you're debugging code and you're like, now I'm to an interface. Or you're in your IDE and you control click, right, on a name, and you end up at the interface. Well, that's where debugging kind of separates it, right? Because debugging is going to follow the execution. It's not going to dump you in the interface. It's going to dump you in the concrete class or the method that's calling that class or the interface. So it makes it easier to find some of these things that otherwise you would have difficulty finding. That's just one example. Now, in this case, let's say I've got in here and I figured out, okay, this value is set to null. I'm happy with that, but I want to get out now. I've found what I want, so then I'm going to click out. I want to step out. So I step out. Now, it goes back here. Now, I'm not actually back to where I was. Instead, I'm back to the previous thing, right, which is the fetch all and doctrine. But I want to step out of that again to go back to where I was. So now I'm back in my action where we originally were, and the next line there, it stops there, which is returning the HTML response. I've bypassed the connection. Now I can see out here to the right now, I can see all the information from Doctrine Deball of that being created, right? Because it's already been executed. The way debugging works is when you're in your IDE, the current line that is highlighted, the current line that is being executed, doesn't have a value yet. It's still executing. The execution has stopped at the beginning of that line. Therefore, it hasn't actually happened yet. So sometimes you might need to set the breakpoint for the next line that executes. You can't put a breakpoint on an empty line. There's nothing to execute there, so it's kind of skipped. So you want to put a breakpoint on the next line that's executed to see what the value of the previous one is. So now going back to that, right now I'm on this return, but I can look up in the connection and everything, and I can even look down here in the panel and see the values that were set there. Make this a little bigger. So I can go into, for instance, the request and break into it. I can see server params, URI, information about it from Diaktaros in this point. I can see everything is being requested through. Everything is part of the request. Now, another nice thing about this panel is if I were to click on any of these, right-click on them, I can change the values. So let's say you're debugging through and something has a wrong value. You can right-click on it, change the value, and then continue going forward. And everything will continue executing as if the value was unchanged, as if you hadn't changed it. So it's another easy way to debug your code, an easy way to find possible fixes for problems, is to be able to change the values here in real time as it's executing. Usable, right? That's awesome. How many people have done that? Yep. Okay, good. So as we go through, now I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I've gotten as far as I needed to there. Now, this is just a simple one. This is just calling the list action. So nothing too extravagant. But what if I wanted to troubleshoot an edit action or something along these lines? So, excuse me. So now that I've stopped execution there, I can come back to the browser. It died on me, of course, because it didn't necessarily get the signal it was expecting. Sorry. To get everything back, I need to turn off my listener. Stop listening. Stop debugging. I had to turn it off. Okay, so now go back to the browser. I can get this back. So now I got my migrations list, the different conferences in this case. I got some good debug information there. Now let's say I wanted to go and edit something, and I need to see what my ID is as I'm trying to edit something, right? Well, if I click it, of course, now I'm going to go to the form where I can just freely edit this and make anything I want to. But it didn't debug because I forgot to turn on my listener. But you can see it's very simple. It's just passing the ID. It's just the database ID. This isn't an enterprise level app. I'm not really that concerned about it. So we'll go back. Now let me go back to my IDE, though. I want to close all these tabs so I can start fresh. I'm going to turn on my listener. I'm clicking out to the top right there. Activate my listener. Now come back to my form. Now the IDE is listening. So I'm going to click on Edit. I could click View, but I'm going to click Edit. And now, of course, the browser's loading. Right now it's loading. It's kicked it back to PHP Storm. If I come back to PHP Storm, I can see that it is debugging. Right? And I can follow through. I don't know what I'm going to get this time. Let me see. I'm probably not going to get what I want. So let me fix that project. So I need to go to my update action. I need to add some breakpoints so it stops. Otherwise, it's just going to continue through. Let's add one here. I won't do one there. I'm just adding a couple random breakpoints so we can see some stuff if we wanted to. Okay, now now that I've added the breakpoints, it'll actually stop there if I click step over. I don't want to step into, I don't want to go into that, but I will step over. It'll stop at the first breakpoint, which is activating the guard, is validating the storage of it's, again, we're using slim CSRF, and I'm activating the guard here after I instantiated it in the factory, passed it in, and now it's using it here in my action. And you can see the first two items where we have attributes, we have Flash and CSRF being done. You can see those objects out here to the right just as visual representations. I can look down here in the debug panel, and I can see the values of those. I can see that I actually have some storage here. I got my CSRF names and key pairs. I can look down in my guard. I'm going to move this up a little bit. I can go down in the guard, and I can see the information that's set for the CSRF there. Anyway, so we can see this stuff executing. I can actually edit my key value pairs here if I wanted to. Maybe I wanted to test this and make sure it fails. The easiest way is just to come in here and edit that value and click forward, and it'll fail because my CSRF token's broken, right? Of course, we're all using CSRF in our forms, yes? Yes? Good? All right. You should be. You should be using it everywhere. CSRF, all the things. So anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So we have that valid. I'm coming in here. I'm setting my token and my key, validating them. And then I'm coming down to my query. Now, we notice that these, now if I mouse over them, I've got values, right? I can see that guard has 7 values in there. And they are down here in the bottom section. I could go in and see the values of them. Maybe I want to see the value of my ID. You know, what am I actually requesting in this execution? So if I go into my request and I look at attributes, I can see I've got ID number 17 here. Right? So I can see that, yes, the application is doing maybe what I expected, maybe not what I expected. Maybe that's not the ID that I expected. Maybe I wanted to troubleshoot with a different ID, so I could right-click on this and change it and make it another ID and continue on forward. It's very easy to go through and debug. Now, I could even add a listener. Say I wanted to, in debugging, say I wanted to know anytime ID is activated, right? Maybe I don't want to have to dig through all this and go through all the breakpoints and everything else. So I could turn on a listener inside the IDE and say, anytime you see ID, let me know. And then it would let you know in another panel. And there's actually quite a few things that you can do here. By right-clicking, you can turn on inspectors, you can set the value, you can copy the value if you needed to. You can copy value as, you could do multiple different things in here. You could add a new watcher on the ID, like I said, or whatever you're clicking on. Again, we can see our server params if we wanted to look through. We can see the server params to make sure that what we're getting in the get variable is what we're expecting. Make sure that's coming through there. And your query params, what have you. We have the get. It's using the get method. We can dig in and see that. Maybe with some sort of an API, we're using other methods. We would see those here. So again, that's being able to debug and go through and see these things is really, really helpful. So now we don't have to do those echoes and var dumps and all this other ugly things that break up our code, make it ugly, even though we're supposed to fix it, right? So if I step over, now I'm going in, I got get attribute, I'm building a query here, using the query builder from Doctrine. I can step into that if I wanted to see, okay, how's it going to build all that? Step back out, so I go back to where it was. And this enables us to go through and be able to debug in great detail. We can get a lot of detail out of this. All right. Where am I at? Oh, I want to stop my listener. There we go. And stop debugging. That always catches me. So when you are debugging with an IDE, you always want to make sure you stop, right? There'll be times when you go back to the browser and you click refresh or something like that. You're like, why is it still doing that? It's because you didn't stop it. So you want to go back and stop it. Turn off your listener so that way you can go back to normal mode. I mean, most developers, the way we develop is we code something and we go to the browser, refresh, code something, go to the browser, refresh, right? And so debugging enables you to do that really easily. All right. Now if we go back here. We got our site back. All right. So again, that's the basics of being able to debug. Where am I at? There we are. So debugging, that's all I have for debugging because that's really the basics of it, right? And I didn't want to cover too much in depth. I wanted to cover the basics. The idea is to get more people debugging. Now, you are going to use an IDE. I don't talk much about using the command line. PHP now has a command line debugger. Maybe I'll add more on that at another time, but that's not what I have here. So I'll take some questions, but I just wanted to say thank you for listening. Again, you can find, I have code, and the code for this is going to be online eventually. Right now it's in a private repo. I'm still finishing it. But once I finish it in the next week or so, I'll make that active on github.com/Adam Culp. You can also find more information from me on my podcast. I podcast at rungeekradio.com. I talk a little bit about running and a lot about PHP and things related to PHP. You can also find me on geekyboy.com. That is my technical blog. And, of course, on Twitter at Adam Culp. If there's any questions, I can take some questions. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Oh, there we go.
There you are.
Hi, Adam. Okay, so if the debugger is not listening, is there a noticeable performance impact? What's the performance?
Say it again?
If the debugger is not listening, is there a performance impact we should expect?
So if you're running a debugger on the server, is there an impact if you're not actually doing debugging, is what you're asking?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, there is. So because the debugger is still working, even though it's not actively being used, I don't recommend running a debugger on your production code, unless you absolutely need it. You want to use it in development, you want to use it in testing, things like that. One other thing, I think this may have been fixed, but Xdebug, for instance, or Composer used to give warnings if you're, excuse me. Composer used to give warnings if you had Xdebug running, because it used to cause problems. There was a potential there. It definitely made it run slower, right, because of that. So the answer is yes, it can cause slowdowns, but that's why you only use it in development. Yeah, it's not meant to be a production tool. You should fix your problems in development, and then when you push to production, you shouldn't have those problems, because your production should mirror your development environment. Anybody else? Uh-oh, I'm in trouble now, a speaker asking a question. Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Can you show me how conditional breakpoints work?
Say it again, sorry?
Can you show me how conditional breakpoints work?
Conditional breakpoints. I'm not set up for that right at the moment.
Okay, fair enough.
But we can cover it offline. We can play. I do use them. Conditional breakpoints are amazing. So you can set in a condition, so you add a breakpoint and then you add a condition to the breakpoint of stop if this condition is met, right? Just like the breakpoints I was using, but it's conditional. And it's actually quite easy to set up. I'm just not set up with an example of that to be able to show it smoothly. So, but we can definitely play afterwards. Yeah. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? Thank you.